Wasteland was developed by Interplay and published by Electronic Arts in 1988, a pioneering RPG featuring one of the first persistent reactive worlds in gaming history. Its financial success prompted Interplay CEO Brian Fargo to make a sequel, but EA owned the IP and elected to produce its own follow-up in-house. This resulted in 1990's Fountain of Dreams, a pseudo-sequel to Wasteland set in post-apocalyptic Florida. It actually improved upon some aspects of the original, including better graphics and some impressive reactivity for the time period, but its sadistic difficulty and smaller scope has left it mostly forgotten today. During the early phases of Fallout's development, the team considered using GURPS, a generic tabletop system capable of supporting a wide variety of settings. Nearly every RPG on the market had a fantasy setting then, so instead they considered a sci-fi game, but that overlapped with the Star Trek titles Interplay was already developing. Around this time in late 1994, the publisher of the system, Steve Jackson Games, announced GURPS Survivor, an ill-fated post-apocalyptic supplement that was never released. Then inspiration hit. Why not remake Wasteland? Nearing the end of the year, the team talked about where GURPS Wasteland could go, but they soon learned EA still had some degree of ownership over the IP. Artist Michael Dean later mentioned the rights were so complicated, Interplay gave up trying to figure out who owned them. Afterwards, the team kept the setting and made Fallout instead, which was a spiritual successor to Wasteland, as Tim Kaine disclosed in his GDC 2012 presentation.
Wasteland, of course, can't say this strongly enough. Fallout is very much a spiritual successor to Wasteland. Almost everybody who played the game or who worked on Fallout had played Wasteland. When we started, I had not played it. So of course, somebody gave me a copy, said go home this weekend, and I was addicted to it, played it all the time. It's kind of hard playing it on a more recent computer because if you've ever tried playing it, it goes too quickly. You have to put in a speed limiter, otherwise you shoot across the screen when you try to play. But this game had everything in it that we wanted to have in Fallout, including no strict morality like the Ultimate games had. We wanted the player to be good or evil, do anything he wanted, go anywhere he wanted, and be only really restricted by how skillful he was at playing a game.
However, in more recent videos, he's mentioned that many team members didn't actually play it.
In a previous video, I said some people had played Wasteland on the team, and some people hadn't. Which led to a comment going, I can't believe Wasteland wasn't an influence, they obviously played Wasteland. Yes, some people had played Wasteland, some people hadn't.
Leonard Boyarsky echoed the former sentiment in an interview as well.
It's funny that when we first started making it, we decided we wanted to be a post-apocalyptic game that was mostly me and Jason pushing, like sometimes subtly, sometimes not so subtly, like we shouldn't do fantasy, we should do this post-apocalyptic thing. But eventually everybody got on board with that, and it was only after we decided we were making this post-apocalyptic game that we started hearing that Brian thought it'd be a good idea to make Wasteland 2, and we all thought that was a really good idea too. I really didn't know that much about Wasteland at that point, and I started playing it a little bit, but it was too fast. The version I had didn't work on the computers. I would say modern computers at the time. I had a Pentium. It was too fast to play Wasteland. There was no way to play it at that point, and it came out later on the 10th anniversary, I think, of Interplay's. But by that time, we were deep into Fallout. So when he said that, I'm like, that's great. We'll throw a Wasteland 2 title on there. It'll sell more copies. And I don't know why I never even thought like, well, I should probably like research Wasteland 2 and figure out what that game's all about, because we're going to make it Wasteland 2. We just kept making the game we were making. We never ever changed anything. The only things we did is after we couldn't get Wasteland 2 and kept it being Fallout, we threw in some references like the guy who said he was a desert raider, not a desert raider, a desert ranger. It's not Ian, I can't even remember his name. I remember what he looks like. But we put little nods to Wasteland in there after the fact. But yeah, we never, I don't know if in the back of our minds, we never thought we'd get it or we didn't care, but we never changed direction or did anything in any way, shape, or form to make it an appropriate Wasteland 2 title.
It depends on who you ask, though, as the game's 2 lead designers were heavily inspired by it. After Scott Campbell left, Chris Taylor took his place, and when asked about the Wasteland connection, he replied, Wasteland was one of the games that made me want to be a computer game designer. There were a couple of key ideas from Wasteland that formed the core of the work that I did on Fallout. Player actions should have consequences, and statistics matter. Fallout 2 designer Colin McComb concurred, mentioning, Well, seeing as you have 2 former TSR employees and a horde of old pen and paper enthusiasts working on the game, I'd say that we're familiar with Gamma World. However, the posts that nail Wasteland as the major influence are more accurate. Now, the question as to how much Gamma World influenced Wasteland. Brian Fargo has also talked about how it affected the vision statement for Fallout.
When we did the vision document for Fallout, 6 out of 10 things were right out of Wasteland. I mean, it was bang, they were right there. I mean, as people have heard before, the only reason there is a Fallout is because I didn't have the rights to do Wasteland 2.
Regardless of how much influence it actually had, they did include many homages, and future games would too. Everything from game mechanics and items to dialogue and quest design.
Fallout, a post-nuclear role-playing game.
This inspiration even applied to marketing, as Fallout was described as a post-nuclear RPG, while Wasteland's manual states it's a post-nuclear Holocaust adventure. The inside of the big box release even states, "Remember Wasteland?" The official website also mentioned it was made by the creators of Wasteland. Despite not being billed as a sequel to Wasteland, many early players thought it was, which makes sense considering they were both post-apocalyptic games developed by the same company, and both even shared some team members. Alan Pavlish was one of the most important team members on Wasteland, and he was even the executive producer of Fallout. He had very little input, as executive producer is often a vanity credit, and for some reason his name doesn't actually appear in the credits. But he had this role for pretty much every game Interplay released in 1997. Much of the iconic talking head dialogue was written by developer Marco Green, and he was also an important designer on Wasteland. It's worth noting the first Fallout drew from a long list of different sources for inspiration, taking cues from films, games, novels, comic books, and tabletop RPGs, to the point that it's impossible to say where any given element might have come from short of developer confirmation. However, the amount of overlap between Wasteland and its spiritual successor is fascinating, regardless of intent. At the Blades base in the Boneyard, the Vault Dweller can have a conversation that plays out like this. Christine, see the itty bitty ducks? Vault Dweller, them are not ducks. Christine, oh yes them are. See the itty bitty wings? Vault Dweller, YLB, them are ducks. This joke wasn't translated, so it must have been very confusing for foreign players. This is a direct reference to a phonetically spelled scroll in Stonekeep, a 1995 dungeon crawler also made by Interplay. In turn, this is likely a reference to Wasteland. In quartz, the player can compliment a barmaid at Scott's Bar. You can phonetically say, "You are a beaut, Ellen," to which she replies, "You are a cutie too," before giving the player a quest. The duck is supposedly also a reference to Battle Chess, another early Interplay title. The producers were apparently known for always removing a feature to leave their mark on the final product, so the developers added a duck sprite that followed the queen piece around. When the producers reviewed it, they apparently only asked for the duck to be removed. In other versions of the story there was no duck, and it was symbolic for adding a feature only to be removed, in the hopes of saving other features. The authenticity of this story is questionable at best though, and I suspect the reference only dates back to Wasteland. When talking to NPCs in Wasteland and Fountain of Dreams, you have the option to input keywords. If you type in the right word or phrase, you'll be given new information, and sometimes the right response is required to advance quests. This is very similar to the Tell Me About system in the first game, where you can input keywords that trigger unique responses. Unlike its predecessor, Tell Me About isn't required to progress, but there is interesting information that's only relayed through it. Wasteland's graphic death descriptions are one of its most memorable aspects. Enemies aren't just killed, they're sent spinning into a dance of death, turned into a mortician's nightmare, or left in a heap of unrecognizable gore. This would seemingly inspire the brutal critical hit messages in its spiritual successor, which features lines like, "Squashing the rodent skull like a wet paper bag," or, "Sadly, he is too busy feeling the rush of air on the brain to notice death approaching." Brick makes a reference to turning an enemy into thin red mist, another combat description from Wasteland.
The other guys hate mapping this zone, but hey, I love it. I love turning the muties into a fine red mist with my gun.
Cassidy, a companion in the second game, had his last 3 combat lines lifted directly from Wasteland 2, including, "Gonna grind you into a thin red paste," "I'm gonna reduce you to an Undertaker's nightmare," and "I'm gonna blast you into ground round." When you enter the lair of the Cochise AI, it tells you should have left well enough alone. This is an old phrase and may not have influenced future games, but interestingly it does get mentioned 3 separate times in New Vegas by Lily, God, and Dean Domino.
So, can't leave well enough alone, have to enter Vera's room. Some things are better left in the past, partner.
It's probably best to leave well enough alone, dearie.
It's your own fault you're here. Couldn't leave well enough alone.
Your ride's over, Muty. Time to die.
Horrigan's Muty dialogue is easily one of the most iconic lines in the series, and it's possible the slang came from Wasteland. In some encounters, muties are mentioned, mutants are an enemy type, and the word would also be mentioned in Fountain of Dreams. Originally released on Apple II, Commodore 64, and IBM compatibles, there wasn't enough room on the floppy disk for all the text they wanted to include. So much of it was included on a paragraph booklet that came alongside the game. To confuse players who tried to read ahead to get hints on what to do next, the developers added a large number of fake paragraphs, including an intricate storyline of the Desert Rangers traveling to Mars. In one section of this false plot, the Martian warlord gives the player a fire lance, which from the description seems to essentially be a flamethrower. In Adatum, there's a character named John Zimmerman. There's a cut quest where the player would have rescued his son Jason from raiders. When speaking to Jason, he would have said, "Hey, are you from really far away? Have you had a lot of adventures?" The player could reply, "Actually, I'm from Mars. Want to see my fire lance?" This would have been a great reference, and it's too bad it didn't make it in. 20 years after it was mentioned in Wasteland, and over a decade after its one mention was cut from Fallout, it randomly appeared as a weapon in the 3rd main entry. This is one of the coolest homages Bethesda has ever included, and I don't think it gets enough credit. Upon dying, you can hear the line,
Your life ends in the wasteland.
nearly the exact same line from Wasteland's death screen. Both also depict the skeletal remains of the player. Toaster repair is a skill in Wasteland used to repair toasters, which will likely give the player power packs, a rare ammo type for energy weapons. Dane, a crazed member of the Children of the Cathedral, has a line asking the player if they know how to repair a toaster. I couldn't get this line to trigger though, so I'm not sure if it has a specific condition or if it's bugged. In the second game, Jeremy and Gecko mentions he wouldn't trust Skeeter to repair a toaster. After repairing the bomb in Megaton, 3Dog will mention,
"Got some great news out of the town of Megaton. Turns out the live atomic bomb in the town center has finally been deep-sixed for good. The town sheriff, one Lucas Sims, commissioned the one, the only lone wanderer from Vault 101 to disarm the nasty nuke. And the kid delivered. Hey, nice work, 101. Next time you're in the neighborhood, pop into the studio. Old 3Dog's toaster's been on the fritz."
In one of Rawls' notes at Black Mountain, it's also stated he helped Tabitha fix a toaster. The cut EPA area in the second game was also going to have an intelligent toaster that could be repaired. Even though it didn't make it in, it would later serve as inspiration for the toaster in Old World Blues. Both games take place in a sparsely populated barren desert in the southwestern US, patrolled by raiders and irradiated monsters that randomly attack you as you travel. There's also some notable overlap in the creatures you fight. In Wasteland, there's a bizarre cast of enemies like mutated rabbits, zombies, and lizards, and the opening text reveals they were mutated by radiation. Fallout would give a similar explanation for its creatures, though it separated itself by having many creatures also mutated by FEV. Old World Blues was an homage to the series' roots and has a long list of references to Wasteland, perhaps the most obvious being the giant Robo-Scorpion, a reference to the Scorpitron boss in Wasteland. One of them can be found terrorizing the streets of Vegas, and much like the giant Robo-Scorpion, they're one of the most powerful enemies in the game. Shadow Claws are deadly mutated lizards encountered in the mineshaft location, easily capable of killing an entire team of low-level rangers. Their difficulty would inspire Scott Campbell to make Deathclaws, which would later become the series' most recognizable monster. Rad Rats are a common enemy found in the mineshaft area, and they later appeared in Fountain of Dreams. Irradiated rats did appear in the first 2 games and used the internal name Rad Rats, but it's unknown if the name was related to Wasteland. They're also mentioned by one of the squatters outside Vault 15, and the player can mention them to one of the talking Deathclaws. Both lines use the phrase, "I don't give a rad rat's ass," and now I imagine that being a common saying throughout the Wasteland. Rad rats were actually planned for Old World Blues and would have dealt radiation damage on each attack. They also exploded on death, giving more rads to nearby players, but they were sadly cut. They would later appear in both Nuka World and 76, but I'm not sure these versions were inspired by what came before. The mines also have mole rats and geckos, two other creatures that would make appearances in various Fallout titles, meaning this one location might have single-handedly inspired 4 different creatures. Feral ghouls are similar in name and look to a number of zombie creatures found in Wasteland, like pit ghouls, shambler ghouls, and spineless ghouls. Though several devs on the team were also aware of the Moro Project, a tabletop RPG that featured mutated, undead humans who emit rads. One of the first locations you reach in the first game is Shady Sands, a farming village plagued by rad scorpions. Likewise, one of the first locations you reach in Wasteland is the Agricultural Center, a farming village plagued by bunnies and rats. This army of mutated critters is led by Harry the Bunny Master, one of the first bosses of Wasteland. In the cancelled sequel to Brotherhood of Steel, there was going to be a sequence where you crashed your car on your way to Lubbock, Texas. Afterwards, you'd come across a family in a farmhouse that needed help. Their garden was overrun by giant rattlesnakes the player needed to defeat. After traversing a maze of giant mutated corn, you'd encounter an albino rattler, and the man controlling these creatures, Harry the Rattlemaster. This was a nice homage, but it wasn't meant to be. The Brotherhood of Steel was inspired by the Guardians of the Old Guard, a fanatic group of xenophobic tech hoarders who worship old world tech like Visa cards and utilize energy weapons. They even hoard power armor, though it should be noted that power armor has been a part of various RPGs for years before either series, like Gamma World's Mark I power armor. The Old Guard is based out of the Citadel, an obsidian fortress in Arizona, the same name of the Brotherhood's Pentagon base in the third game. In early design documents, the Master's Cathedral lair was named the Citadel, while the Children of the Cathedral were named the Children of the Citadel, likely another homage. In Wasteland 2, there would also be a group named the Children of the Cathedral, bringing the reference full circle. They'd even acknowledge the reference and refer to themselves as a Brotherhood.
The gift I want to pass on to you, the weak, the downtrodden, the persecuted and enslaved. Come to the new Citadel, join our Brotherhood.
Wasteland's apocalyptic event was a war between the Soviet Union and the US. Scott Campbell also considered making the Great War between the same two superpowers, but ultimately decided against it. Quote, "The nuclear Armageddon in the backstory was between the US and China. After shipping, several people asked me why China and not the old standby, the Soviet Union. I made the choice when I remembered experiences with Oleg, a Moscow developer I worked with months before when I was assistant producing a typing game. Once, in the middle of a phone conversation, I heard some muffled bangs, and the phone went quiet. And when I asked him what the noise was, he replied, 'Oh, it was just the Russian mob firing their guns in the street.' I thought he was joking. He wasn't. After that, I had a really hard time believing the once mighty USSR would be in a position to threaten the world anytime soon. So I turned to the next major communist country that typifies the East, China. In Wasteland, there's a group called the Servants of the Mushroom Cloud. They worship the nuclear apocalypse as a divine event and view nuclear energy as a gift from God. They even worship inside of a temple full of radioactive material.
As Bishop of Gravestone, I am the sworn caretaker of the sacred idol of Plutonius.
The cult of Plutonius and tactics is very similar. Ghouls who worship a nuclear warhead. It's possible this was inspired by Wasteland, but lead designer Ed Orman was also a longtime fan of Gamma World, which featured a religious order called the Radioactivist, a similar group who would baptize their followers in the divine glow of radiation. The cult of Plutonius also mentions another religious figure called Atom.
And Plutonius said to Atom, "He who collides with another particle will in turn split the air asunder with shimmering power until his enemies are vanquished."
It's unknown if it was an intentional homage to Tactics or Wasteland, but the Bethesda titles would feature a similar cult in the Children of Atom, who once again worship radiation. The first game's plot revolves around the Master transforming pure-strain humans into mutants. The Cochise AI has a similar plan to repopulate the planet with pure life after exterminating all humans. Pure-strain humans also played a pivotal role in Gamma World, however, survivors who had avoided mutation and acted as one of the game's playable races. You could also make a comparison between the Cochise AI and the Calculator in Tactics, as both are seemingly Terminator-inspired computers operating out of pre-war installations, and both control an army of killer robots attempting to destroy all humans. But as far as I know, no one on the Tactics team played Wasteland apart from producer Chris Taylor. In Wasteland, the player can build a useful robot companion named Vax, which inspired the name of the AI at the Glow, Zax. One of the first quests in Wasteland is to repair a water pump in High Pool, very similar to the first game's main quest of retrieving the water chip.
Say, I'm working on a book about the Wasteland. It'd be great to have the foreword by a vault dweller. Help me out, would you?
In the third game, the player can help Moira make the Wasteland Survival Guide, which is the name of Wasteland's manual. It would then appear in New Vegas and ended up being one of the few connections between the games, as Josh Sawyer stated. There are very few links between F3 and FNV, including the Wasteland Survival Guide shows the wider impact and influence of the Lone Wanderer from F3 on the world. It would then appear in Fallout 4, making it one of Wasteland's most prolific influences. Wasteland's take on the post-apocalyptic genre featured goofy comedy like being ambushed by super ninja koi dogs waiting for you in a pile of laundry. The first Fallout mostly avoided this kind of humor apart from special encounters, but pretty much every single sequel has featured a wealth of wacky comedy in the same vein. The equipment system would also go on to inspire many items. The Proton Axe is the strongest brawling weapon in Wasteland, and it would also appear as a powerful melee weapon in Old World Blues. Blood Sausage and Thin Red Paste are healing items also introduced in the DLC. Both are references to Wasteland's combat messages, but Blood Sausages were also a consumable item. Night Stalker squeezings in Old World Blues are a reference to snake squeezings, which is the equivalent of alcohol in Wasteland. At the hub, the player can buy iguana bits, which are made from people. In the town of Needles, the player can likewise buy nutritious hobo dogs, made from hobos. These would later become long-running gags in both franchises. In one section of the Citadel, a member of the Guardians throws a nuke grenade at you that irradiates the square it lands on, not unlike the mini-nuke or nuke-a-grenade in later entries. In Wasteland, there's a settlement called High Pool. If the player falls into the river by mistake, a group of children will laugh at you. You can then attack and kill them if you want. If you kill all of them, you'll encounter the Red Rider, a mysterious vigilante who tries to avenge the children you murdered. There's also the Red Rider BB gun, the most powerful gun in the game. Despite being referenced multiple times, it isn't possible to attain unless you use an exploit. By having two loot bags that point to the same memory address, you can access a super loot bag. These glitch containers have all sorts of items the player was never meant to attain, like the very best armor named AC Armor. There's also useless entries including player nationality as an item, like Russian, and player gender like female. This is one of the few instances where we know Alan Pavlish was involved, as Tim Kaine recounted. It's funny, I talked to one of the programmers for Wasteland who was the executive producer for Fallout, Alan Pavlish. He talked me through those loot square and super loot squares used in Wasteland. I didn't want it to work that way. Best of all, super loot bags could score you the Red Rider, a BB gun dealing over 700 damage per hit, capable of killing the majority of enemies in a single attack. The Red Rider BB gun would later appear in the first game, but it's mostly a joke weapon as it only deals 1 to 3 damage. There is a limited edition variant found in a special encounter, which deals 25 damage per hit and has a high chance of criticals, actually making it pretty useful for luck-based builds. Tim Kaine seemingly confirmed this was a Wasteland homage in a post-launch interview, stating, "You'll finally be able to see what exploding like a blood sausage really looks like. We're violent like Wasteland, and I think we share the same feel in the Adventure Seeds. Remember the boy's dog that you went looking for and found, but it was rabid and you had to shoot it and the boy hated you? We have seeds like that. Seeds that make it tough to be a good guy. Seeds that are just plain dark in tone. And then there's a rumor of a certain weapon." It would then appear in the second entry at Sierra Army Depot. in the inventory of a cryo-frozen soldier named Sergeant Dobbs. Eldridge also mentions it in his floating text.
Well, you can't save everyone, kid. And you really killed the hell out of those raiders.
In BOS, the Vault Dweller will give you the weapon if you save all the townspeople in Carbon, and once again it was a notably effective weapon, though extremely difficult to actually attain. After that it was mentioned in Exodus, the Fallout tabletop game that was hit by a lawsuit from Bethesda, forcing the creators to remove all references to the IP, but a single mention of the Red Rider did make it in. Fallout 3 would also have a BB gun, though they didn't include the Red Rider name for whatever reason. Possibly because they didn't even know the homage was to Wasteland at this point. In New Vegas, we'd also get the unique Abilene Kid BB gun. The BB gun would then appear in both Wasteland sequels, potentially making it one of the most influential RPG weapons of all time. The first game has the assault rifle weapon, which is described as an AK-112 model, possibly a reference to Wasteland's fictitious AK-97 weapon. The canteen item in Wasteland will help the player's team avoid dehydration and damage while traversing the desert. Likewise, the Vault 13 canteen helps the Vault Dweller avoid random dehydration encounters on desert tiles. New Vegas would bring it back over a decade later, once again helping the player stave off dehydration in hardcore mode. To reach some areas of Wasteland, you need rope to descend. To reach the lower levels of the Glow in Vault 15, you also needed rope. Both also feature leather armor, but each game separately took inspiration from Mad Max, so it's likely these aren't related. Laser pistols and laser rifles would also be featured in both. They even share the same timing of weapon progression, as they're some of the most viable late-game weapons in the first games of each series. You can find a fusion cell in Vegas and Wasteland. Microfusion cells would later become an ammo type in every major Fallout release, and fusion cells would also become a power source for generators and power armor in the fourth game. In one section of Fountain of Dreams, there's a velvet picture of Elvis, something that would later appear in one of Fallout's special encounters. In the courthouse and courts, you encounter three brothers named Huey, Louie, and Dewey. Each has a wristband that has a 2-digit number on it, and the three codes can be combined to open a safe later on. At the Raider base in the second game, you can find 3 dog tags that also have 2-digit numbers, which can likewise be used to open a safe. 5 of the 7 special stats came directly from Wasteland. Perception is also a skill, meaning the only missing special stat in Wasteland is Endurance, though it does have an equivalent in MaxCon. Charisma is also a dump stat in the first entries of each franchise, though there's no way that was intentional. Skills and stats in Wasteland could also be used to varying effects outside combat, allowing the player to solve problems in multiple ways. For example, a locked door could be picked, but it could also be busted open using the strength stat, pried open using a crowbar, or even blown apart using explosives. There's also a similar sequence like this in the Temple of Trials. In the first 2 games, you can also open many doors and force fields using explosives, while crowbars can even be used to unlock some containers and doors. There's also overlap in terms of skills themselves, as many skills have a direct equivalent in Wasteland. At the beginning of Wasteland, you start out as a lowly private, but as you gain experience, you eventually rank up to titles like Senior Specialist and General Argent. This system of levels having their own rank would end up in Fallout, like Vault Veteran and Desert Wanderer. In Wasteland, there's an old howitzer that can be used to blow up some buildings in a settlement called Needles. In the second entry, you need to use a howitzer at Sierra Army Depot to blow open the gate and gain access. Likewise, you can use artillery in Old World Blues, which can be used to destroy a town and reveal loot. In Hypole, you can get a quest from a kid named Bobby to find a missing dog. It later turns out to be Rabbit, and you're essentially forced to kill it. After returning to him, he attacks you, and the quest has no happy ending. Arguably, the only somewhat positive ending is to leave the dog to starve and have the child never know what happened to it. Tim Kaine used this no-win quest design as examples to other designers during Fallout's development. The second entry had a very similar quest where the player can rescue their cousin's dog from geckos. If you wait too long to save Smoke, he dies. But even if you save the dog, the villagers end up eating him later on. These are some of the first available quests in each game, and they're so similar, Wasteland must have served as inspiration. In Wasteland's Las Vegas, there's a casino war between Fat Freddy and Farron Brygo. Fat Freddy, the antagonist, asks you to kill Farron Brago. In Junktown, the casino owner Gizmo, who is also the bad guy, asks you to kill the town sheriff Killian. Tycho even mentions Gizmo reminds him of a fat freak in Vegas, and the entire quest was potentially inspired by what came before. Farron Brago was named after Brian Fargo, and its spiritual successor would make similar developer jokes, like Chris Avallone the Bounty Hunter or McRae, a reference to Fergus Urquhart's middle name. In the graveyard and courts, many of the headstones have amusing comments like, Lester Moore, shot in the head with a .44, no less, no more. In the den, there's a similar grave that reads, Here lies the body of Jonathan Blake, stepped on the gas instead of the brake. Some of the graves in Wasteland reference the developers, and several Interplay devs would later be immortalized in F2's graveyard. In Wasteland, firearms can get jammed during combat, requiring you to spend a turn fixing them before they can be used again. In Fountain of Dreams, jammed weapons have a chance of completely breaking. Fallout would build on these ideas, and critical failures can cause weapons to break, you can lose your turn, and they could even explode or set you on fire. Fallout 3 and New Vegas would have a similar jamming system where damaged weapons take much longer to reload. Wasteland's weapons had single and burst fire modes, both of which would appear in the first 3 Fallout titles. In '76, there's a holotape game called Wasteland. They did an awesome job replicating the art style of Wasteland, and to me, this is one of the coolest tips of the hat to the series' roots. It has a text-based combat system, a similar map style, and even includes a character named Wasteland Surgeon. Some squares in Wasteland have radiation that violently discourage the player from passing through them if they don't have radiation suits. Radiation would be used in a similar fashion in the Glow, stopping players from advancing who didn't have Rad-X or Rad-Away. Rad suits would later then become armor in future games. During the day, radiation isn't visible in Wasteland, but it can be seen at night or if the player has a Geiger counter, another item that would become an iconic element of Fallout. High exposure to it in Wasteland can outright kill you, and lower doses will give you radiation sickness, a status affliction that stops you from healing over time. Absorbing too much radiation would have similar effects throughout the Fallout franchise. Fountain of Dreams had an interesting system where being attacked by mutated creatures would gradually cause your characters to transform into mutants, giving them new abilities, but these mutations would also stop your health from regenerating. I can't think of many games that utilize this concept, but 76 does have something similar. Radiation will give your character mutations that give both positive and negative effects. Bizarrely, both games even have a mutation named Chameleon. In 76, it will turn you invisible as long as you stand still while not wearing armor. In Fountain of Dreams, it seems to slightly decrease your chance of being hit. Nuka World takes place in an abandoned theme park, and Fountain of Dreams was going to have a parody of Disneyland called The Tragic Kingdom, but it didn't make it into the final game. I suspect there's many more references throughout the series, but researching this and replaying Wasteland for the first time in years gave me so much reverence for what came before. Wasteland laid the foundations that Fallout was built on, and its groundwork can still be seen in the structure of its spiritual successor over 25 years later.